Imagine waking up to a sky so dark, crops failed for years. The year 536 wasn't just bad. It was apocalyptic. A mysterious fog rolled across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, blocking sunlight for 18 months. Temperatures plummeted, and famine spread like wildfire. Tonight, we'll uncover what caused this worst year to be alive. Was it volcanoes? A comet? Something even more sinister? The truth is stranger and more scientifically fascinating than you might expect. Grab your favorite blanket, dim the lights, and let's unravel history's greatest mystery together. Picture this. You wake up one morning in 536 AD, and the sun never properly rises. A strange haze blankets the sky from Europe to Asia, turning daylight into an eerie twilight that lingers for 18 months. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like a dim bulb flickering on its last legs. It wasn't just cloudy. This was something far more sinister. Crops stopped growing. Birds fell silent. People lit lamps at noon because the gloom made it impossible to work. This wasn't some local weather event either. Chinese records from the same year describe yellow dust falling from the sky and frost in July. Irish chronicles mention a failure of bread across the land. From Constantinople to Chang'an, people whispered that the gods were angry or that the apocalypse had arrived. And honestly, they weren't completely wrong. When your primary light source suddenly loses 90% of its brightness worldwide, it's reasonable to assume something's terribly wrong with the universe. Now, here's where it gets scientifically fascinating. Modern researchers examining ice cores discovered a massive spike in sulfate deposits around 536. These telltale chemical signatures point to an earth-shattering volcanic eruption, probably multiple eruptions, that pumped so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it acted like a giant solar shade. We're talking about particles so fine they could stay suspended for years, scattering sunlight back into space while letting just enough through to keep everything looking perpetually overcast. The real kicker? This volcanic fog didn't just drift away after a few weeks like normal ash clouds. Computer models suggest the particles may have formed a persistent aerosol layer in the stratosphere, creating a self-sustaining haze that took over a year to dissipate. Think of it like the world's worst case of smog, except instead of coughing from car exhaust, you're watching your food supply disappear because nothing can photosynthesize properly. What made this particular atmospheric event so catastrophic was how it targeted humanity's weakest point: agriculture. Without proper sunlight, staple crops across the northern hemisphere either failed completely or produced stunted, useless yields. Wheat withered in the fields from Italy to India. Vineyards produced grapes with no sugar content. Even hardier crops like barley barely sprouted before freezing in unseasonable frosts. Food reserves that normally lasted through winter were gone by autumn, leaving people to grind birdseed into flour or boil tree bark for something resembling nutrition. The psychological impact was just as brutal. Imagine spending every day under that sickly yellow sky, never seeing stars at night, never feeling proper warmth on your skin. Byzantine records describe mass religious processions begging for deliverance, while local mystics claimed the moon had eaten the sun. In Ireland, chroniclers recorded that the sea made no return of fish. Even offshore fisheries mysteriously collapsed, cutting off one of the last reliable food sources. We can actually see the desperation in surviving artifacts from this period. Archaeologists have found abandoned farming villages where people clearly tried and failed to plant seeds multiple times in a single season. There are records of Roman senators selling family estates for a few bags of grain. And, perhaps most chilling, multiple cultures from this period suddenly stopped building in stone, switching to wood and mud construction like they knew civilization itself was hanging by a thread. The atmospheric changes did more than just block sunlight. They triggered a chain reaction in global weather patterns that scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Average temperatures dropped about 2.5 degrees Celsius globally, enough to make summer feel like winter and turn winter into something unbearable. Tree rings from this period show almost no growth, indicating years of stunted vegetation. Even areas that escaped famine found themselves dealing with freak weather events, from monsoons arriving months late to rivers freezing solid by early autumn. Here's what fascinates volcanologists about the 536 event. Normal volcanic winters typically last months. The Tambora eruption in 1815 caused the famous year without a summer, but its effects faded within 16 months. The 536 haze persisted for nearly twice as long, suggesting something extraordinary happened, possibly back-to-back eruptions from different volcanoes compounding the effect. Recent studies point to Iceland's Katla volcano as the likely first culprit, followed months later by an even larger blast somewhere in the tropics. That 1-2 punch would explain why the dimming lasted so long and affected both hemispheres equally. The environmental consequences moved faster than anyone could adapt. In Central Asia, entire nomadic tribes abandoned their traditional grazing routes as grasslands turned brittle and lifeless. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence shows people resorting to eating their seed grain by mid-536, dooming next year's harvest before it could even be planted. Mediterranean villages that had thrived for centuries emptied out as survivors migrated south, only to find the famine had beaten them there. Bizarre weather became the new normal. Byzantine accounts describe blood-red rain falling over Constantinople, likely from Saharan dust caught in the altered atmospheric circulation. Chinese astronomers recorded an unprecedented number of dark stars in the sky, probably the dimmed sun reflecting off high-altitude volcanic dust. Even the ocean currents changed. Sediment cores show unusual mineral deposits washing up on coasts where they'd never appeared before. Now, here's where our volcanic detective story takes an interesting turn. Until recently, scientists assumed the 536 disaster stemmed from a single mega eruption. But ice core chemistry tells a different story. The sulfate spikes appear in distinct layers separated by months, suggesting multiple volcanic events across different latitudes. This explains why the climate impact was so severe and prolonged. First, a northern eruption, likely Katla, pumped ash across Europe and Asia. Then, before that dust could settle, a massive tropical volcano, possibly in Indonesia, fired volcanic gases high enough to circumnavigate the globe. The social ramifications were immediate and brutal. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire saw its carefully maintained irrigation systems fail as snowmelt from the mountains vanished. Constantinople lost nearly 40% of its population to starvation within 2 years. Celtic Britain reverted to subsistence-level farming as trade networks collapsed. And everywhere, people turned on each other. Legal codes from this period suddenly include harsh new punishments for grain hoarding and food theft, crimes that had previously been rare. What made 536 unique wasn't just the environmental catastrophe, but how it exposed the fragility of interconnected societies. The Roman Empire still had functioning trade routes stretching from England to Egypt, when the haze appeared. Within 2 years, those routes carried famine instead of goods. A merchant ship that once transported olive oil and wine might now be smuggling sacks of barely edible millet at 50 times the normal price. Cities that imported most of their food starved first, while rural areas fared only slightly better as they exhausted their meager reserves. Archaeologists can trace this collapse through pottery fragments. High-quality Roman tableware production plummeted as kilns went cold, not because potters died, but because no one could spare food to trade for dishes. Coins from this period show unusual wear patterns, suggesting people were rubbing them together constantly to check if their money was still valid. Even the church changed. Surviving sermons from 536 to 538 contain increasingly desperate pleas for divine mercy, along with donations of land by terrified aristocrats hoping to buy salvation. The darkening of the sky in 536 wasn't some cosmic mystery. It was geology's revenge. The leading culprit, not one, but multiple volcanic eruptions so massive they essentially turned Earth's atmosphere into a dirty windshield. This wasn't just a bad year for weather. It was a full-blown volcanic winter, where ash and sulfur particles hung in the air for years, blocking sunlight and dropping temperatures across the globe. Here's how it works. When a volcano erupts violently enough, it doesn't just spew lava. It shoots sulfur dioxide gas high into the stratosphere, where it reacts to form tiny reflective particles called sulfate aerosols. These particles act like a sun shield, scattering sunlight back into space before it can warm the ground. A big enough eruption can cool the planet for years. And in 536, we're pretty sure it happened at least twice. The evidence is literally frozen in time. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica show massive spikes in sulfate deposits right around 536. Think of these ice cores like tree rings for the atmosphere. Every layer captures a snapshot of what was floating around up there. The sulfate concentrations from this period are some of the highest ever recorded, suggesting eruptions on par with the biggest in human history. One study found sulfate levels nearly 3 times higher than what followed the 1815 Tambora eruption, which famously caused the year without a summer. Trees tell the same story. Dendrochronologists, that's scientists who study tree rings, have found an almost worldwide pattern of stunted growth starting precisely in 536. From Irish oaks to Siberian pines, trees basically stopped growing normally for several years. Some Scandinavian pines have rings so narrow they're almost invisible for 536 to 538. This wasn't just a local drought. It was a global vegetation crisis. The scale was unprecedented. Today, scientists estimate these eruptions ejected between 30 to 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, Mount Pinatubo's 1991 eruption, which measurably cooled Earth for 2 years, released about 20 million tons. The 536 events may have been up to 5 times stronger, and because they likely happened in the northern hemisphere, the effects were especially brutal for Europe and Asia. So where exactly did these world-changing blasts occur? That's where things get messy. Volcanoes don't come with timestamps, and we're dealing with events from 1,500 years ago. The best guesses point toward Iceland and possibly North America. Some researchers think the first punch came from Iceland's Katla volcano, known for absolutely massive eruptions. Others argue for an unknown volcano in Alaska or British Columbia. There's even evidence suggesting a tropical eruption, maybe Ilopango in El Salvador, followed by a northern one a few years later. The Iceland theory has gained traction thanks to some clever detective work. Scientists found tephra, volcanic ash particles, in European peat bogs, matching the chemical fingerprint of Icelandic volcanoes. But the smoking gun, or smoking crater, has been hard to pin down. Ice core samples show at least two distinct sulfate spikes between 536 to 540, meaning this wasn't one bad day for Earth, it was several years of atmospheric punishment. What made these eruptions so devastating was their timing and location. Unlike tropical volcanoes that mainly affect weather patterns, northern eruptions near population centers like Europe and Asia could spread ash and aerosols more efficiently across the most heavily inhabited regions. The sulfate particles didn't just block sunlight, they created acid rain that poisoned soil and water supplies. Imagine trying to farm when your fields are getting dripped on with weak sulfuric acid. The immediate effects read like the opening of a disaster movie. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a portentous sight where the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. Chinese records mention yellow dust falling from the sky and summer frosts killing crops. Irish chronicles describe a failure of bread in 536 to 539. The climate didn't just change, it broke. Average summer temperatures in Europe and Asia plummeted by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius almost overnight. That might not sound like much, but for crops growing at the edge of their temperature range, it was lethal. Grain harvests failed across the northern hemisphere. Fruit didn't ripen properly. Pasture grasses grew stunted, meaning livestock starved too. With no way to preserve or store enough food, human populations were staring down mass famine within months. The volcanic aerosols didn't just chill the planet. They may have disrupted weather patterns globally. Some researchers think the eruptions triggered shifts in monsoon cycles, potentially causing droughts in Africa and floods in America. Ancient Puebloan communities in the Southwest suddenly abandoned their settlements around this time. Mayan cities experienced unusual cold snaps. Whatever happened in 536? It wasn't contained to the Mediterranean. Why does all this matter today? Because volcanic winters aren't just ancient history. The same physics that screwed over the 6th century could happen again. When underrated Yellowstone rumbles or an unknown supervolcano wakes up, we'd face similar challenges, except with 8 billion mouths to feed instead of maybe 200 million. Our globalized food systems might be even more vulnerable to sudden climate shifts than medieval farmers were. The real lesson of 536 isn't about volcanoes, though. It's about domino effects. The eruptions themselves were bad, but what came next was worse. First, the sky darkened, then crops failed, then people starved. And when societies are weak from hunger, guess what shows up next? That's right, the plague. But we'll get to that. For now, picture 6th century farmers looking up at a sun that couldn't warm them, watching their children get hungrier, and wondering if the gods had abandoned them. The scary part? They had no way of knowing this was just chapter 1. That dust cloud blocking the sun wasn't the disaster. It was the starter pistol for years of suffering, and the worst was yet to come. The summer of 536 never actually arrived. Temperatures across Europe and Asia dropped so suddenly that people went straight from winter coats to thicker winter coats. Ice core data shows average temperatures fell by around 2.5 degrees Celsius globally, an astonishing plunge for an era before climate control. For comparison, The difference between today's climate and the last ice age was only about 6 degrees Celsius colder. This wasn't just a chilly summer. It was the beginning of what scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age. Tree rings tell the brutal story best. Samples from that period show growth virtually stopped for several years straight. Normally, hardy oaks produced rings so thin they're nearly invisible under microscopes. Some Siberian pines show obvious frost damage right in the middle of what should have been their growing season. Imagine being a 6th century farmer, watching your crops wither in July because the temperature suddenly dropped below freezing overnight. That became everyone's new normal. The chill hit agriculture like a sledgehammer. Mediterranean vineyards, normally reliable even in bad years, produced grapes so sour they were useless for wine. Irish wheat fields yielded about 1/5 the normal harvest. Chinese imperial records note summer frosts killing entire rice paddies. Even drought-resistant millet failed across North Africa. And these weren't isolated incidents. Tree ring data shows the cooling lasted at least 15 years, with 536 to 540 being the absolute worst. Food supplies collapsed with terrifying speed. Constantinople's grain dole, which normally fed 100,000 people, stopped functioning within months. Roman legal codes suddenly included desperate new punishments for grain hoarding. In Ireland, monks recorded people eating things not normally considered food by the second winter. That's code for bark, grass, and probably each other. Bodily remains from this period show widespread signs of malnutrition, including porous bones and stunted growth in children. The cooling reshaped entire landscapes. Alpine glaciers advanced further than they had in centuries, swallowing pastures whole. Forests retreated as trees froze where they stood. Scandinavia's growing season shrank by nearly 2 months, a death sentence for farming communities. Even the behavior of animals changed. Byzantine hunters reported flocks of birds migrating at all the wrong times, if they migrated at all. The natural world basically forgot how to function normally. What made this climate crash so deadly was its timing. Earlier generations might have had food reserves to ride out a bad year or two. But by 536, many societies were already stretched thin. The Eastern Roman Empire was fighting expensive wars against the Sassanids. China's Jin dynasty had recently fragmented. When the cooling hit, there simply weren't stockpiles to fall back on. Administrators from Italy to India reported emptying granaries within months. Technology couldn't save them either. 6th century farmers had no way to artificially warm fields or protect crops from freak frosts. Storage methods were primitive enough that whatever little grain survived the harvest often molded before winter's end. Even fishing became unreliable. Colder waters apparently disrupted fish migrations, leaving coastal villages starving next to seemingly endless oceans. The economic dominoes fell fast. Gold coin hoards from this period show weird wear patterns, suggesting people constantly rub them together, likely checking if merchants still accepted currency. Pottery production nosedived, because who needs fancy dishes when you can't afford bread? Construction projects froze, quite literally in some cases, as mortar wouldn't set properly in the cold. Even the slave trade collapsed. Why buy workers when you can't feed yourself? Religious responses grew increasingly frantic. Byzantine Bishop John of Ephesus described mass processions, where starving citizens dragged icons through streets, begging for relief. Irish monasteries recorded more visions of hellfire than any other period. Some Norse sagas might reference this era when they describe Fimbulwinter, the mythical 3-year winter that heralds Ragnarok. When your leaders can't explain why the sun won't warm you, you start making up apocalyptic stories. Climate scientists now understand what happened at a molecular level. Those volcanic sulfates didn't just block sunlight. They fundamentally changed how heat moved through the atmosphere. Normally, the jet stream flows west to east in relatively straight lines. But cooling the stratosphere can make those winds wobble dramatically, like a slowing top. That's why some regions got unprecedented snow, while others suffered droughts. The whole system went haywire. The human cost became visible quickly. Graveyards from this period show sudden spikes in child burials, always the first victims of famine. Archaeological sites reveal abandoned farms where people clearly tried replanting crops multiple times before giving up. Some Germanic villages switched from settled farming to nomadic herding almost overnight, a desperate attempt to follow whatever patchy grass still grew. Then the rats arrived. With granaries emptied and cities starving, rodents searching for food found perfect conditions to multiply. This becomes important later when we talk about plague. For now, just imagine the psychological toll of watching your last sack of grain disappear down a hole while your kids scream from hunger. Some historians argue this pest explosion was almost as devastating as the famine itself. The strangest effects were the unpredictable ones. Byzantine historians wrote of blood rain falling over Constantinople, likely Saharan dust picked up by weird wind patterns. Chinese astronomers recorded daytime stars appearing months after the initial eruption, probably sulfates refracting sunlight. Even the ocean changed. Fishermen in Gaul reported catching tropical-looking fish that definitely didn't belong there, suggesting sudden current shifts. What's terrifying is how fast civilization unraveled. Complex societies need surplus, extra food, extra labor, extra everything to function. The cooling ate that surplus alive. Tax revenues cratered as farms failed. Roads fell into disrepair because who's fixing highways when they're scrounging for roots? Literacy rates probably plunged as surviving kids worked fields instead of studying. Step by step, the world became poorer, hungrier, and more desperate. This climate shock also redrew trade maps. Constantinople's merchants stopped caring about Egyptian silk when they needed Crimean grain more. The amber road from the Baltic collapsed entirely. Pretty jewelry doesn't feed families. Even local markets dwindled as villages retreated into self-sufficiency. Some historians argue this economic disintegration made the later plague spread worse, since isolated communities had no immunity to outside diseases. Biology worked against them too. Cold-stressed crops become more vulnerable to mold and pests. Malnourished livestock produce less milk and fewer calves. Hungry humans succumb more easily to everyday illnesses. Every natural system that normally helped buffer bad years instead amplified this disaster. It's like the whole web of life decided to snap at once. Perhaps worst of all, nobody knew if it would ever end. Today, we understand volcanic winters typically last a few years, but 6th century people had no reference for extended cooling. Each spring that failed to warm reinforced the terror that maybe, just maybe, this was how the world ended, not with fire or war, but with a slow, starving chill. By 538, entire regions approached breaking point. Britain's post-Roman towns emptied as people returned to subsistence farming. The Merovingian kingdom saw peasant revolts against landowners still demanding taxes. In Persia, The Shah suspended tribute payments because nobody had anything left to give. Even the mighty Eastern Roman Empire teetered. Its legendary grain supply system shattered beyond repair. Then, just when things couldn't seem worse, the first plague victims began coughing up blood. But that's a story for another section. For now, remember this. The cooling of 536 wasn't just bad weather. It was the key that unlocked every catastrophe that followed: famine, poverty, societal collapse. And all because some unseen volcano halfway across the world decided to sneeze sulfur at the worst possible moment. The famine that followed the climate catastrophe of 536 wasn't just hunger. It was societal collapse in slow motion. When crops failed across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the food chain snapped at every level. Farmers watched their fields wither. City dwellers saw market stalls empty. Governments that had fed their people for centuries suddenly had nothing to offer. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote what might be the most chilling summary: "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse." But this wasn't an eclipse passing in hours. It was starvation setting in for years. His accounts describe bread riots in Constantinople, where people cursed at the sky as they fought over scraps. In Ireland, monks recorded a failure of bread from 536 to 539. Simple, stark words for unimaginable suffering. The mechanics were brutally straightforward. No summer sun meant stunted crops. Grain yields, the calorie backbone of ancient societies, plummeted by an estimated 60 to 70% in some regions. Wheat stalks grew half their normal height. Fruit trees budded but never ripened. Northern areas that relied on a short growing season got hit hardest. Some Scandinavian settlements show archaeological evidence of entire communities disappearing during this period. People did desperate things. Archaeological digs in Bavaria have uncovered 6th century skeletons with the telltale bone lesions of chronic malnutrition. Adults who stood barely 5 feet tall, their bones light as bird wings. In China, imperial records mention villagers boiling leather armor for broth. Irish chronicles tell of families abandoning infants in the woods when they couldn't feed them. Cities became death traps. Urban populations relied on grain shipped from agricultural regions, but when those regions failed simultaneously, the system collapsed. Constantinople, with nearly 500,000 residents, saw its state-controlled bread dole shrink to nothing. Emperor Justinian's treasury reportedly melted down church gold to buy emergency shipments from Egypt, only for those shipments to arrive spoiled or insufficient. The countryside fared no better. Peasants who couldn't pay taxes in grain lost their land. In Gaul, legal records show a spike in property seizures by local lords. Some farmers fled to monasteries, trading freedom for gruel. Others turned to banditry. Roman military dispatches mention armed groups raiding dwindling storehouses. Secondary effects crept in. Without grain, people couldn't feed livestock. Herds starved or were slaughtered early, leaving no breeding stock. Oxen, essential for plowing, disappeared first, creating a death spiral. No animals meant worse harvests next year, which meant less food for remaining animals. Archaeologists find almost no cattle bones in European settlement layers dating to 540 to 545. Trade routes unraveled. With no surplus goods to transport, shipping dwindled. Mediterranean shipwrecks from this period show marked decreases in commercial cargo. Coins minted after 536 contain more copper, likely because gold supplies from mines couldn't reach mints. Even simple commodities like olive oil became luxuries, Ceramic studies show amphorae shipments collapsing by 80% in some markets. Societal contracts broke down. Laws from Justinian's code prescribe harsher penalties for food theft during this period. Burgundian legal texts show kings desperately trying to regulate grain prices, an admission that normal market mechanisms had failed. In Persia, tax collectors reported entire villages empty. Their populations vanished like smoke. Religious institutions became last resorts. Monastic records from Monte Cassino describe daily queues of starving peasants begging for soup. In Syria, church almshouses expanded dramatically, then ran out of supplies themselves. A bishop's letter from Antioch complains about having to choose which mouths to feed when donations dried up. The body count mounted. While no contemporary census exists, skeletal evidence suggests some regions lost 30 to 50% of their population. Cemeteries in Britain show a sharp increase in child burials, always the first indicator of famine. In Trier, mass graves contain skeletons stacked like firewood, with no grave goods, burials of haste and exhaustion. Psychological scars ran deep. Icelandic sagas written centuries later still recalled the Fimbul Winter, a mythic multi-year winter that clearly echoes the 536 disaster. Chinese poets wrote of ghost villages where only rats moved. Even the Quran, compiled later, contains verses warning of a day when the sky brings visible smoke, possibly referencing oral traditions about the dimmed sun. Migration patterns shifted. Armies couldn't recruit enough healthy soldiers. The Byzantine military lowered height requirements for new troops, a telling detail preserved in military logs. Lombard tribes moved south into Italy, partly because their northern pastures failed. Even the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain may have been spurred by failing crops in Denmark. The famine's timing made everything worse. It hit just as Rome's Western Empire had collapsed and the Eastern Empire was fighting Persia. Tax revenues evaporated right when armies needed supplies. Justinian's famous plague, coming in 541, would kill millions, but the famine ensured those deaths would be catastrophic by weakening populations first. Economic systems simplified. Gold coins became rarer as trade contracted to barter. Pottery styles grew cruder. Archaeologists call it the post-Roman simplification. Even literacy declined. Manuscript production nearly stopped in some regions. When survival dominates, culture frays at the edges. Some areas adapted better. Alpine communities shifted to hardier rye. Desert-edge oasis towns relied on drought-resistant dates. But the overall picture was collapse. The Roman annona system, state grain supply, vanished outside Constantinople. Persian Qanat irrigation networks fell into disrepair. Chinese northern dynasties saw mass migrations southward. The famine revealed how thin the margins were. Ancient societies could weather political upheaval, but take away just 3 consecutive harvests, and everything collapsed. No grain meant no taxes, no trade, no armies. Starving people don't maintain aqueducts or schools. The sophistication of late antiquity depended on full stomachs. We see echoes today. Modern food systems, while more resilient, still assume stable climates. A 2010 Russian heatwave caused global wheat prices to spike 70%, triggering food riots in Africa. The 536 disaster reminds us that full supermarkets aren't a historical constant. They're a recent, fragile luxury. The famine's end brought little relief. Populations didn't bounce back quickly. Tree rings suggest poor harvests continued sporadically until 550. Societies that lost craftsmen, farmers, and leaders struggled to rebuild. The Dark Ages stereotype oversimplifies, but the mid-6th century genuinely was a demographic low point. Most chilling are the silent victims. History records emperors and bishops, not the anonymous millions who woke each morning weaker than the last. Their skeletons tell the real story. Fused vertebrae from carrying non-existent loads, porous bones from endless hunger, teeth worn down chewing bark bread. This wasn't just bad weather, it was humanity losing a fight against indifferent physics. The volcanic aerosols didn't care about empires. The cold didn't spare children. Nature rolled the dice, and for a generation, almost everyone lost. And then, because disasters love company, just as some regions started recovering, the first plague ships reached Constantinople. But that's another horror story. For now, consider how quickly order vanishes when empty stomachs outnumber full ones. The ancients learned that lesson brutally in 536. Our turn hasn't come yet. But the physics haven't changed, just our luck. The famine weakened more than bodies. It broke social immune systems. When the plague arrived in 541, it would find perfect conditions. Malnourished people, disrupted trade, fractured governments. Starvation hadn't just killed millions, it had prepped the survivors for the next disaster. But that's a story for the next section. For now, picture a world where every meal might be your last, where parents outlived children, where civilizations that had stood for centuries crumbled in a handful of hungry years. That was the real legacy of 536. Not just a dimmed sun, but an unlearning, a visceral understanding that everything we build rests on the fragile assumption that the sky will stay bright and the fields will keep yielding. When that stops, so does everything else. Just when survivors thought things couldn't get worse, the plague arrived in 541. It didn't creep in quietly. It exploded onto the scene like nature's final insult after years of famine. The disease first appeared in Pelusium, Egypt, carried by fleas on black rats stowing away in grain ships. Within months, it reached Constantinople. By 543, it had spread as far as Ireland. Procopius witnessed it firsthand. People had a sudden fever, swelling in the groin or armpit, then black blisters on their skin. Some victims died the same day symptoms appeared. Others lingered in agony for weeks. The swellings, called buboes, gave the plague its name, bubonic. But this wasn't just any outbreak. Modern estimates suggest it killed 25 to 50 million people, up to half the population in some regions. Imagine being a 6th century doctor. You've spent years treating colds and broken bones. Suddenly, patients arrive with feverish eyes and egg-sized lumps turning purple. They cough blood. Their skin blackens with internal bleeding. You try every remedy, herbs, incisions, prayers, but 9 in 10 die anyway. Within weeks, you're not a healer anymore. You're just someone who moves bodies before they stink up the street. The plague thrived on pre-existing misery. Malnourished immune systems crumbled before the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Crowded refugee camps became perfect breeding grounds. Trade ships that barely functioned during the famine now carried death in their holds. Even the weather helped. Cooler temperatures allowed flea populations to boom. Constantinople got hit hardest. At its peak, the city buried 5,000 people daily. Emperor Justinian caught it, but survived, his feverish body spasms described in vivid detail by court historians. The wealthy fled to country estates only to find plague already there. Mass graves overflowed so badly that towers on the city walls were stuffed with corpses. Procopius wrote that the stench made it impossible to walk near the harbor. Symptoms progressed with terrifying speed. Morning, a slight headache and fever. Noon, swollen lymph nodes painful to touch. Night, delirium or unconsciousness. Some victims developed pneumonic plague, a lung infection that spread through coughs, bypassing fleas entirely. This version killed within hours and made lockdowns impossible. Entire families died in their homes unnoticed until the smell alerted neighbors. The biological mechanisms were brutal but effective. Fleas bit infected rats, then bit humans. Bacteria multiplied in lymph nodes until they burst into the bloodstream. Septicemia, blood poisoning, followed, causing gangrene in extremities. Hence the Black Death nickname from darkened fingers and toes. Some victims survived the buboes but lost noses or limbs to necrosis. Rural areas suffered differently than cities. Villages had fewer rats but also fewer doctors. Some communities lost everyone. A Byzantine tax document from 542 shows whole regions suddenly paying nothing, not because of rebellion, but because no one remained alive to farm. Conversely, islands with strict quarantine protocols sometimes escaped entirely. Economic impacts were immediate. With workers dead, harvests rotted in fields. Construction projects halted mid-wall. Justinian's grand cathedral project, the Hagia Sophia, faced labor shortages despite offering double wages. Inflation skyrocketed as surviving craftsmen realized their scarcity value. A law from 544 complains that bricklayers demand outrageous pay or refuse to work. Religion offered little comfort. Some saw the plague as divine punishment, flagellating themselves in penance. Others turned to debauchery, reasoning they'd die anyway. Churches tried maintaining burial rites, but soon resorted to mass graves. A bishop's letter describes blessing pits already half full before the prayers ended. Odd exceptions occurred. The wealthy often died faster than the poor, possibly because their houses had more rat-friendly storage areas. Some malaria-prone regions saw lower plague rates, suggesting previous mosquito-borne illnesses conferred partial immunity. And, strangely, doctors who performed autopsies had better survival rates, perhaps because fleas avoid fresh blood. Trade routes became plague highways. The disease reached England not via Rome, but through Mediterranean grain ships docking in Cornwall. It entered Persia along caravan routes despite attempts to quarantine travelers. Even monasteries weren't safe. Isolated communities got infected when traders delivered ink or communion wine. The psychological toll reshaped societies. Some parents abandoned sick children. Others refused to bury neighbors, fearing infection. Laws from the period show new penalties for throwing plague corpses into public fountains. Graffiti in Pompeii, surviving from earlier times but still relevant, reads, "Nothing lasts forever," a sentiment surely echoed across the 6th century Mediterranean. Medical understanding was hopelessly outdated. Doctors blamed bad air or planetary alignments. Treatments included rubbing onions on buboes or drinking powdered emeralds. One Byzantine physician recommended hanging live chickens around patients' necks. Actual preventatives, like avoiding flea bites, went unrecognized. Archaeology confirms written accounts. Mass graves in Bavaria hold jumbled skeletons with no signs of violence, just the telltale damage to rib cages that suggests enlarged lymph nodes. DNA analysis of teeth from this period consistently finds Yersinia pestis bacteria. These weren't normal deaths. They were biological annihilation. Secondary effects compounded the disaster. Fields went untended. Tax revenues collapsed. Justinian's wars stalled for lack of troops. Persia faced rebellions when garrisons died. the Eastern Roman Empire never fully recovered its pre-plague population or economic might. Some historians mark this as the true end of antiquity. The plague cycled for 200 years. After the initial 541 to 549 wave, it returned roughly every generation until 750. Each outbreak killed newcomers who lacked immunity. This prevented population recovery and kept societies in perpetual fragility. Constantinople's population didn't rebound to pre-plague numbers until the 10th century. Ironically, survivors sometimes benefited. With labor scarce, peasants could demand better terms from landlords. Wages rose where records exist. The plague may have inadvertently sped the transition from Roman slavery to medieval serfdom. Fewer workers meant treating them better. Some women gained property rights when male heirs died out. Cultural memory lasted centuries. The Arabic term ta'un still refers specifically to plague, not just epidemics. Norse sagas, written 300 years later, describe a great dying that matches the timeline. Even the word quarantine originates from Venice's later policy of isolating ships for 40 days, 40 giorni, during Black Death outbreaks. Modern parallels exist. COVID-19 showed how quickly panic can override reason. Vaccine skepticism mirrors 6th century mistrust of doctors. And like Justinian's plague, the rich initially thought they were immune, until private jets and gated communities proved useless against a microbe. Biology hasn't changed much either. Yersinia pestis still causes occasional outbreaks. Madagascar had 2,400 cases in 2017. Modern antibiotics treat it effectively, but some strains show drug resistance. A 2018 study revived ancient plague bacteria from a 5,000-year-old skeleton, proving how durable this killer remains. The plague's timing was cosmically cruel. Coming after volcanic winters and famine, it hit populations already on their knees. Immune systems weakened by hunger surrendered easily. Social structures cracked by years of stress shattered completely. What began as atmospheric chemistry ended in mass graves. Survivors faced a hollow victory. You might live through the dim sun, the frozen summers, the empty stomachs, and the plague, only to find empires gone, cities empty, and half your family missing. Recovery took generations. The 6th century's real tragedy wasn't the disasters themselves, but how they kept stacking until civilization buckled. And buckle it did. With governments gutted, economies in ruins, and populations halved, the stage was set for total societal collapse. Kings became figureheads. Bureaucracies vanished. Common people abandoned cities for subsistence farming. The grand structure of antiquity, already shaky, finally fell apart. But collapse isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a farmer tossing aside his tax notice because no official remains to enforce it. Or a road slowly overgrown as merchants stop coming. Or an entire generation that grows up never knowing what libraries once held. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed futures. And as we'll see next, some things, once broken, stay that way. The collapse wasn't sudden. It wasn't armies storming palaces or rebels burning cities. It was slower than that, more like watching a house sink into wet ground. First, a crack appears in the wall. Then a window frame warps. The door stops closing properly. You can live with these problems for a while, until one day the whole structure gives way. That's how societies fell apart after 536. Start with taxes, the backbone of any government. With harvests failed and populations dead or scattered, tax collectors couldn't fill their quotas. Byzantine records show provinces sending letters begging for reduced assessments because the men who worked the land are gone. In the West, Roman tax lists from Italy suddenly stop being updated around 550. Not because someone declared taxes abolished, because the officials who kept records had died or fled. No taxes meant no salaries for soldiers, no maintenance for roads, no grain dole to keep cities fed. The Eastern Roman Empire managed to keep paying some troops by melting down church silver. But in Francia, local strongmen took over military duties, a shift that would eventually create feudalism. When the people who enforce laws stop getting paid, laws stop being enforced. Cities emptied in phases. First, the poor starved or left. Then, artisans followed when nobody could buy their goods. Finally, the rich abandoned their townhouses for fortified country estates. Archaeologists can trace this through ceramic finds. Less and less imported pottery over time, replaced by crude local copies until even those disappear. Rome's population may have dropped from 500,000 to under 50,000 across the 6th century. The countryside fared slightly better, but not much. Without cities to sell crops to, farmers grew just enough for themselves. Iron tools became scarce. Without urban blacksmiths, villages couldn't replace broken plows. Some Germanic law codes from this period assign equal value to a sword and a team of oxen. Both had become that precious. Infrastructure failed quietly but completely. Aqueducts clogged without maintenance. Roads grew over with grass. A Danish study found some Roman highways in Gaul were completely impassable by 600. In Britain, people literally forgot how to make mortar. Stone buildings from the 550s onward use mud instead of proper cement. Governments didn't so much collapse as evaporate. The Western Roman Empire was already gone by 460, but its remnants, provincial administrations, legal systems, lingered in places. After 540, those too faded away. A papyrus from Egypt shows a local official complaining he can't find literate men to staff his office. The last known Roman census happened in 541. Then, the bureaucrats died or fled. Refugee movements reshaped continents. Britons fleeing famine and plague crossed to Brittany, giving the region its name. Lombards abandoned the Danube for northern Italy, creating a new kingdom. Slavic tribes moved into the Balkan vacuum, left by Justinian's plague-ravaged armies. In China, northern dynasties weakened by years of cold weather fell to nomadic invaders. The loss of knowledge was staggering. Mediterranean ship captains, who'd once navigated by written charts, now hugged coasts because no one remembered open water routes. Complex crop rotations vanished. Farmers replanted the same grains until soil nutrients depleted. Even something as basic as bricklaying became a rare skill. Churches in Gaul from the late 500s used recycled Roman bricks set crookedly into walls. Trade networks unraveled from both ends. Chinese silks stopped reaching Europe, not because the routes closed, but because artisans in Constantinople who wove the fabric had died. British tin mines lay abandoned, not conquered, just forgotten about. A shipwreck off Turkey from around 550 carried the last known shipment of African red-slip pottery. The industry disappeared along with its customers. Legal systems adapted poorly. Roman law assumed functioning courts and literate judges. By 600, most disputes in the West were settled by ordeals. Drop the accused in water. If they float, they're guilty. Burgundian law codes started including fines paid in weapons and livestock because coinage had become unreliable. A Visigothic judge's manual from 580 spends 5 pages explaining what to do when no witnesses can read the Bible to swear oaths. Military power fragmented. The Eastern Empire could still field armies, but discipline eroded. A Byzantine payroll from 556 lists every third soldier as new recruit, untrained. Western forces became personal retinues for warlords. The last standing Roman legion in Britain vanishes from records after 535, likely disbanded when pay shipments stopped arriving from Italy. Religion changed too. Urban bishoprics declined with their cities. Rural monasteries grew powerful as famine survivors donated land for prayers. The old Roman cult of patron saints transformed. People now begged Saint Sebastian to ward off plague rather than honor him as a martyr. In Ireland, monks became the new scholars because everyone else had forgotten how to read Latin properly. Even timekeeping got weird. Roman solar calendars required astronomers cities no longer had. Lunar calendars spread because anyone could look up at the moon. Easter dates started varying regionally. Britain might celebrate it weeks apart from Rome because no couriers carried the official calculations anymore. The monetary economy nearly vanished. Gold coins became so rare that laws set values in grain equivalents. A Frankish king paid his bodyguards with lengths of cloth instead of wages. In Italy, some transactions reverted to barter. A will from 550 leaves, 3 goats and an iron cooking pot to a daughter. Daily life turned inward. Where Romans had built public baths, people now washed in rivers. Theaters became quarries for stones to build hovels. One Anglo-Saxon poem from this era describes a ruined Roman town as the work of giants. The builders' skills now seemed supernatural. The demographic hole lasted centuries. Skeletons from 600 show shorter stature and more malnutrition marks than those from 400. Some areas didn't regain Roman population levels until the 1100s. The Greek word apocoresis, meaning a land's depopulation to the point where wolves roam cities, gets used a lot in 6th century texts. Language itself transformed. Without schools, Latin fractured into early Romance languages. In Britain, Celtic borrowed so many Germanic words it became Old English. Complex Roman legal terms were replaced by simpler Frankish or Gothic equivalents. Villa became town. Civitas became burg. Surviving governments grew desperate. A Byzantine law from 544 tries to force bakers, notaries, and teachers to stay in Constantinople, proof they were fleeing. The Visigothic king Leovigild spent his reign trying to stop nobles from carving up Spain. But with central authority gone, they did anyway. The collapse wasn't total everywhere. Egypt kept some Roman administration because the Nile's reliable harvests sustained it. Persia weathered the crises better by having stronger local governors. But the overall pattern held. Things that needed organization stopped working, and no one had the resources to fix them. Art tells its own story. Roman mosaics gave way to crude carvings. Portraits became stylized because naturalistic painting techniques were forgotten. Even coins, where emperors once had detailed profiles, now showed blurry faces with misspelled names. When people stop having time for art, you know they're struggling. The weirdest survivals show what was lost. In Trier, someone kept lighting the Roman amphitheater's heating system for decades after shows stopped. They'd forgotten its purpose, but kept maintaining it out of habit. In Britain, Post-Roman builders reused stones with Latin inscriptions, set upside down because no one could read them anymore. The technological backslide was immense. Roman concrete recipes were lost. Medieval mortar wouldn't match its strength for 800 years. Water mills became rare outside monasteries. Glass-making declined so much that early medieval church windows used thin slices of alabaster instead of proper glass. New social orders emerged from the chaos. Germanic thing assemblies replaced Roman courts. Landowners became de facto rulers since they controlled food supplies. The Catholic Church filled the power vacuum in the West. By 600, bishops were judging court cases and leading militias. This wasn't the Dark Ages of popular imagination. People didn't suddenly become stupid. They were dealing with stacked catastrophes: less sunlight, failing crops, plague, population collapse. When most adults alive remember nothing but crisis, society forgets how to function normally. The takeaway: civilization is more fragile than we think. Knock out enough farmers, bureaucrats, and craftsmen in quick succession, and centuries of progress can unravel in decades. The people of 536 didn't know they were living through collapse. They were just trying to survive another hard winter, unaware that the world they knew was already gone. And with society in ruins, people did what humans always do. They looked for meaning in the madness. The next chapter isn't about politics or plague. It's about how terrified people tried to make sense of it all, through religion, through myth, through stories that would shape cultures for centuries to come. When the skies darkened in 536, people didn't have climate science to explain it. They had stories. Old stories about angry gods and cosmic battles suddenly made more sense than anything they'd ever known. The world had stopped working normally, and the only explanations that fit were supernatural. Christian writers saw the dim sun as a divine warning. Bishop John of Ephesus described it as a sign above all signs, a biblical plague like the darkness that covered Egypt before the Exodus. Across the Mediterranean, people flocked to churches, convinced Judgment Day was coming. They weren't entirely wrong. For many, their world did end, just not in the way the Bible predicted. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian ordered non-stop prayer services. Processions wound through streets carrying relics, fingers of saints, scraps of the true cross. The idea was simple. Maybe, if enough holy objects gathered in one place, God would stop punishing them. People wore lead amulets inscribed with psalms. They burned votive lamps in their homes, trying to push back the unnatural darkness with artificial light. Celtic monks in Ireland had their own take. Their annals called it the failure of bread and mortality of peoples, caused by the sky raining blood in 536. This likely refers to the weird reddish haze from volcanic aerosols, but to the monks, it signaled a breakdown in the natural order. Some manuscripts show dragons flying through darkened skies, a metaphor for chaos unleashed. The famous Irish poem, The Phantom's Frenzy, describes warriors seeing apocalyptic visions in the gloom. Scandinavian sagas, written centuries later, still remembered this period. They called it the Fimbul Winter, 3 straight winters with no summer in between, heralding Ragnarok. The myth probably preserves real folk memory of the 536 disaster. Viking storytellers described frost giants roaming the land, while the sun and moon hid. Not bad as metaphors for a volcanic winter that lasted over a decade. China's response was more bureaucratic, but just as confused. Imperial astronomers scrambled to interpret the dim sun. Their job was to read heavenly signs. And this was the ultimate failed test. Tang dynasty records mention yellow dust falling from the sky and ruining crops. Emperors issued decrees blaming corrupt officials for angering heaven. Ritual specialists performed elaborate ceremonies with bronze mirrors to reflect back the fading sunlight. Native American tribes had their own explanations. The Hopi tell of a time when the sun did not shine for many months. Their solution? Creating special prayer sticks decorated with feathers to coax the sun back. Mayan texts describe Kawil, the lightning god, growing angry and withholding rain. Their steles show rulers performing bloodletting rituals to appease him during this exact period. People got creative with protective magic. Archaeologists find thousands of late 6th century amulets, lead scrolls with prayers rolled inside, bronze rings inscribed with nonsense symbols meant to ward off plague. One Byzantine charm instructs wearers to say, Philon Arian, useless leaves, 3 times when seeing a sick person, as if words could stop bacteria. Some responses turned downright practical. Irish monasteries started stockpiling grain in round towers, not just for food storage, but because circular buildings were thought to confuse evil spirits. In Gaul, farmers switched from wheat to rye, which grows better in cold weather. This wasn't just survival. It was humans altering their entire culture to match the new climate reality. Religious art changed too. Where early Christian mosaics showed peaceful scenes, post-536 artwork features more demons and hellfire. A Ravenna church mural from 550 depicts angels with swords driving people into pits. Definitely not the gentle shepherd imagery popular before the disasters. Even children's toys got darker. Archaeologists find more clay monsters and less dollhouse furniture in post-536 layers. The disasters birthed new superstitions. A law code from 580 bands, cloud yelling. Apparently, some people thought screaming at the sky would break the volcanic haze. Another law punishes anyone who draws plague marks on doors to steer sickness away from their home. Desperate times make for desperate magic. Some responses were startlingly modern. Roman doctors noticed plague spread faster in crowded areas. They didn't understand germs, but they advised separating the sick. Constantinople briefly banned large funerals because weeping crowds seemed to attract more death. The Bishop of Tours wrote that when people stopped meeting in groups, the plague slowed. 3 cheers for accidental epidemiology. The crisis reshaped language itself. Old English acquired new words like hunger winter and death murk. Latin legal terms faded as people used Germanic words for simpler concepts. Folk moot replaced senate. Weregild replaced restitution. When survival is the priority, fancy vocabulary is the first thing to go. Monks became unexpected heroes. As cities crumbled, monasteries preserved what they could. A scribe in Wales squeezed 4 Gospels into one book because parchment was scarce. Irish monks started writing in the margins of manuscripts, not just prayers, but complaints about the cold and notes like "the cat ate my dinner last night." Even in Apocalypse, petty grievances remain. People memorialize the crisis in odd ways. A brooch found in Kent shows a twisted sun with sad faces, likely a depiction of the 536 dimming. Germanic tribes minted coins with wolf symbols, representing the Fimbul winter legends. The Chinese invented new calendar terms for unseasonable frost and summer snow. Religious authority shifted. Urban bishops lost power as people turned to wandering holy men who claimed special visions. One Syrian hermit became famous for predicting plague outbreaks. He just noticed rats dying first, but people thought he talked to angels. Rome's papacy weakened while Irish monks gained influence. Their remote island suffered slightly less, making them seem blessed. The disasters even changed architecture. Churches added more doorways after 550. Not for beauty, but so crowds could flee plague victims faster. Roman-style basilicas gave way to smaller, darker buildings. Some historians think this was practical, less glass and marble to maintain, but it also fits the gloomier spiritual mood of the times. Burial customs transformed. Pre-536 graves often hold personal items, combs, jewelry, tools. Post-536 graves are plainer, sometimes just bodies wrapped in cloth. Not because people cared less, but because survivors had nothing left to give. Mass graves appeared for the first time since the Bronze Age. Stacked skeletons with no grave goods, just quicklime to mask the smell. Folklore preserved useful knowledge. Stories about hungry ghosts warned against eating spoiled food. Fairy tales depicted witches stealing children, probably memories of real infant abandonment during famines. The Slavic myth of Koshchei the Deathless, who brings plague in a sack, might encode actual quarantine practices. The crisis didn't just inspire fear, it forged resilience. Agricultural manuals from the late 500s stress crop diversity, a hard lesson learned from wheat failures. Byzantine doctors wrote the first known lists of plague symptoms, however inaccurate. Legal codes started including Act of God clauses for weather disasters, humanity's first shaky steps toward disaster policy. Music responded too. Gregorian chants added new modes that sound eerier to modern ears, likely matching the grim mood. The oldest surviving Welsh poetry describes years without summers, and old men forgetting the taste of bread. Even instruments changed. Lyres got quieter, drums more frequent. You don't play cheerful flute music during the apocalypse. The artistic record is heartbreaking where it exists. A child's drawing scratched onto a Roman villa wall shows a tiny figure looking up at a black sun. A votive plaque from Gaul depicts a family with sunken cheeks holding empty bowls. These aren't professional artworks, just ordinary people processing trauma the only way they could. By the 550s, new narratives emerged. Some Christian writers recast the disasters as purification, God pruning humanity like a vine. Buddhist texts from the Silk Road tell of monks sharing food reserves with the starving, calling it karma in action. The Zoroastrian book of Arda Vairaf describes a journey through hellish landscapes, eerily like a volcanic winter. The crisis ultimately changed how cultures viewed time itself. Roman historians wrote in annals, "This happened, then that." Post-536 chronicles are messier, full of gaps where years passed unrecorded. Irish monks invented the Anno Mundi system, counting years since creation, maybe to make sense of the discontinuity they'd lived through. Oddly, some records preserve dark humor. A monastic marginalia from 547 reads, "It's raining ash again, must be Tuesday." A Byzantine graffiti artist drew a stick figure with arrows labeled famine, plague, and tax collector. The eternal annoyance survived even collapse. These responses show people trying to keep their world meaningful amid chaos. When nature broke its promises, sunrise, harvests, predictable seasons, humans remade their stories to fit. Some turned to faith, others to folklore, many just to grim persistence. They also left warnings. Norse myths say the Fimbulwinter precedes Ragnarok, the end of gods and men. Chinese astronomers interpreted the dim sun as heaven's displeasure with corrupt rulers. Irish monks called it divine retribution for human pride. Different cultures, similar message. Civilization is fragile. Now, imagine this happening today, not with prayers and amulets, though some would try, but with science denial, conspiracy theories, and leaders blaming enemies. The human need to explain catastrophe hasn't changed. Only our myths have. Which brings us to a final question. If sky-blocking eruptions triggered history's worst year, what stops it happening again? The answer might surprise you or terrify you, but that's a story for the final chapter. For now, consider how quickly. The year 536 wasn't just a historical catastrophe, it's a warning. With modern volcanoes still active and climate patterns destabilizing, could we face a similar disaster today? The answer might scare you more than you think. Let's start with volcanoes, because that's what kicked everything off in 536. In Titu, the Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'apai eruption shot sulfur dioxide 36 miles into the atmosphere, higher than any eruption since Krakatoa in 1883. Satellite images showed the plume circling the globe within weeks. Sound familiar? That's exactly how the 536 disaster spread. Thankfully, it was mostly water vapor that time, not sulfur. But if a bigger volcano lets loose, we'd be back to darkened skies and failed crops fast. Climate scientists call this volcanic winter, when particles block sunlight enough to drop global temperatures. We've had small previews recently. After Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, global temps fell by about 0.5 degrees for 2 years. The 1815 Tambora eruption caused the year without summer, with snow in June across New England. Both were tiny compared to what likely happened in 536. Here's the worrying part. There are at least a dozen volcanoes today capable of 536 scale eruptions. Yellowstone is the famous one, but others like Taupo in New Zealand or Toba in Indonesia could do it too. Toba's eruption 74,000 years ago may have reduced the human population to just a few thousand survivors. The averages suggest a supervolcano erupts every 15,000 years or so. Guess how long it's been since the last one? About that. But volcanoes aren't our only problem. Modern climate change mirrors some of 536's effects in reverse. Instead of sudden cooling, we've got rapid warming. The IPCC reports global temps have risen 1.1 degrees since pre-industrial times. That might not sound like much, but it's already causing extreme weather that looks eerily similar to 6th century chaos. Droughts killing crops in Europe, floods ruining harvests in Asia, wildfires making skies orange across continents. The difference is speed. In 536, temperatures dropped over months. Today's changes are slower, but potentially just as destabilizing. Both scenarios lead to the same place: food insecurity. Just look at 2010, when Russian heat waves wiped out wheat harvests. Grain prices spiked 70% globally, triggering food riots in Africa. That was one region with one crop failure. Now, imagine simultaneous failures across multiple breadbaskets, like 536, but with 8 billion people to feed. Speaking of food, modern agriculture might be more vulnerable than medieval farming was. Back then, most people grew their own food locally. Today, just 4 countries produce 60% of the world's wheat. Supply chains stretch across oceans. A single blockage, like the ever-given stalling in the Suez Canal, can disrupt global trade for weeks. Now, picture that happening with food staples during climate disruptions. Supermarket shelves wouldn't stay full for long. Disease remains a major threat, too. COVID-19 showed how fast a virus can circle the globe, but at least that had a low mortality rate. When plague hit after 536, populations were weakened by famine. Today, antibiotic-resistant bacteria are becoming more common. A new pandemic, combined with food shortages, could be catastrophic. The WHO warns we're running out of effective antibiotics. Imagine bubonic plague with modern travel speeds but medieval medicine. Our interconnected world creates new risks. In 536, news traveled by horseback. Now, misinformation spreads at light speed. During COVID, we saw how quickly conspiracy theories can undermine public health. Now, imagine that during a multi-year volcanic winter. Flat earthers might be the least of our problems when people start believing the government is hiding the real reason the sun looks dim. There are some advantages we have over the 6th century. Early warning systems can detect eruptions days in advance. Satellites track weather patterns in real time. We understand germ theory and have quarantine protocols. But all these systems rely on electricity and stable governments, 2 things that could vanish fast in a prolonged crisis. Just look at recent disasters. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, basic services collapsed within days. Puerto Rico took nearly a year to restore power after Maria. These were localized events. A global catastrophe would overwhelm response capacities instantly. FEMA's entire annual budget couldn't handle food shortages across multiple states, let alone continents. Infrastructure is another weak spot. Ancient Rome had problems maintaining aqueducts during crises. Today, we've got nuclear plants needing constant cooling, gas pipelines requiring maintenance, data centers that can't overheat. Most cities store just a few days' worth of food. The internet could go down if enough backup generators fail. Once the power stops, water pumps fail next. Then sanitation collapses. Suddenly, we're back to medieval living conditions, but with way more people crammed into cities. Some countries are preparing. Norway built a seed vault in the Arctic. Switzerland stocks enough grain for a year. Finland designs buildings to double as shelters. But most nations assume supply chains will always flow smoothly. That optimism looks riskier every year. In 2021, just 1 blocked canal and 1 container ship shortage disrupted everything from car parts to coffee supplies. The financial system is another vulnerability. In 536, Roman currencies collapsed as trade broke down. Today, we've got digital banking. Until the power goes out or servers fail. Hyperinflation could happen fast if food becomes scarce. During the 2008 crisis, some stores temporarily stopped taking credit cards. Now imagine that lasting months during crop failures. Cryptocurrencies wouldn't help either. You can't eat Bitcoin. So, what's the solution? First, diversify everything. Local food production should increase. Gardens, greenhouses, vertical farms. Cities need backup water sources that don't rely on electric pumps. Homes should have solar panels and batteries. Second, strengthen infrastructure. Bury power lines. Harden grids against EMPs. Store more spare parts. Third, and hardest, coordinate globally. Pandemics and climate disasters don't respect borders. Scientists are working on geoengineering as a last resort. Ideas include spraying reflective particles to cool the planet artificially, basically mimicking volcanoes to counteract warming. It's risky, though. Get the dosage wrong, and you could disrupt rainfall patterns, causing droughts elsewhere. After seeing how 536 played out, maybe we shouldn't mess with atmospheric chemistry unless absolutely necessary. The real lesson from 536 is about redundancy. Ancient civilizations collapsed when multiple systems failed at once. Today, we've built a world optimized for efficiency, just-in-time deliveries, minimal stockpiles, specialized labor. That works great until it doesn't. The survivors in 536 were those who could adapt quickly. Farmers switching crops, towns turning inward, communities sharing resources. Modern technology gives us tools they lacked. Hydroponics could grow food without sunlight. Synthetic biology might engineer famine-resistant crops. Drones could distribute vaccines during outbreaks, but these all assume functioning infrastructure and social order. The hard truth? No technology helps if society panics and fractures first. This isn't about fear-mongering, it's about realism. The geological record shows disasters like 536 happen periodically. Human civilization has lasted about 10,000 years so far, but that's a blink in planetary time. Supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, solar flares, they're all real possibilities. The question isn't if another global catastrophe will happen, but when. The good news, we can see it coming now. Ice cores tell us about past eruptions. Satellites monitor volcanoes 24/7. Climate models predict food security risks. Early warning systems exist for tsunamis and outbreaks. The challenge is acting on warnings before it's too late, something humans have never been great at. Hurricane forecasts give days of notice, yet people still drown in flooded homes. Personal preparedness matters too. Keep extra food and water. Have backup power options. Learn basic skills like gardening or first aid. Know your neighbors. Community ties matter more during crises than any gadget. The prepper movement gets mocked, but they grasp something vital. Systems fail, often unexpectedly. At the government level, policies need to shift. Climate change can't be stopped overnight, but resilience can be built. Update building codes for extreme weather. Fund disease surveillance networks. Stockpile essential medicines. Most importantly, reduce global inequalities. Because when disaster hits, the poorest suffer first and most. The darkest lesson from 536? Collapse isn't a single event. It's cascading failures, weather ruining harvests, famine breeding disease, panic eroding trust. By the time people realized how bad things were, it was too late to stop the dominoes falling. Modern society looks robust, but scratch the surface and you'll find alarming fragility. So could 536 happen again? Absolutely. The engines of catastrophe still exist. Volcanoes still simmer. Climate still shifts. Diseases still mutate. The difference is that now we know how the story goes. Whether that knowledge saves us or not depends on what we do next. Looking back helps prepare for what's ahead. The next section wraps up this journey through history's worst year, not with doom, but with perspective. because understanding how civilizations break also shows how they endure. And humanity, for all its flaws, is stubbornly good at enduring. The survivors of 536 passed down warnings in sagas and chronicles. We've got satellites and science instead of myths, but the message stays the same. Pay attention, prepare, and don't take the sunlight for granted. After all, any given year could become the next worst year to be alive. Hopefully not tomorrow, probably not next decade. But someday, the planet doesn't make promises. 536 wasn't just a bad year. It was a domino effect of disasters. A volcanic haze dimmed the sun, temperatures crashed, crops failed, and then the plague hit. Societies that had stood for centuries crumbled in a few hungry years. The scary part, it could happen again. Not tomorrow, maybe not next decade, but someday. Volcanoes still erupt. Climate still shifts. Our modern world is more connected, but just as fragile. Yet people survived. They adapted, rebuilt, passed down warnings. That's the real lesson. Civilization is fragile, but humanity is stubborn. So next time you see the sun shining, remember, it's not guaranteed. Neither is tomorrow.